My father has always understood that people of all faiths, all backgrounds, and all communities deserve to be celebrated and supported.
The palace gates trembled as whispers spread like wildfire through London's streets. At precisely midnight, Buckingham Palace released a statement that shocked the world. Prince Louis, the beloved youngest royal, faced a devastating diagnosis that palace insiders had desperately kept hidden for years. What doctors discovered would shatter royal expectations forever. As the Queen Consort stood silently at her window, watching crowds gather in disbelief below, one question echoed through every corridor.
I think has to be going around the nation when we launched the survey, and I got to meet loads of amazing families, loads of amazing parents, hearing firsthand what they were going through, what their experiences of parenthood was really like.
Would the monarchy ever be the same? Just minutes earlier, a statement had been released to the world. It was the kind of announcement that the palace communications team had spent weeks carefully crafting, reviewing every word with the precision that only comes when dealing with matters of both personal sensitivity and constitutional importance. The message concerned Prince Louis, the youngest child of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and it carried implications that would reshape expectations for his future role within the monarchy. The official statement was measured in its language, carefully avoiding any sense of alarm while acknowledging a reality that had been privately managed for several years. It confirmed that the young prince had been undergoing medical evaluations and that his condition had reached a point where his future ceremonial obligations and public expectations would need to be reconsidered. The exact nature of his medical situation was not fully detailed, but the message was clear enough for those reading between the lines. The traditional path once anticipated for him would no longer be followed in the same way. Inside the private apartments of the palace, heavy curtains had been drawn against the night. The Princess of Wales stood near the balcony doors, looking out toward the palace gates where a small crowd had begun to gather. Even at this late hour, people were arriving with candles and handmade signs, their messages written in careful script expressing support, prayers, and solidarity. The gathering was modest compared to the crowds that typically form during major royal events, but the atmosphere was notably different. These were not spectators seeking pageantry. They were citizens responding to news that touched something deeply human within the gilded institution of monarchy. The princess did not speak as she watched the flickering lights below. Her hand rested gently against her chest, a gesture that seemed less performative than genuinely reflective of the emotional weight of the moment. The display of public compassion arriving so quickly after the announcement represented both comfort and responsibility. The family had made the decision to share this information publicly, accepting that privacy would be balanced against the public's relationship with the institution they represented. In the lower floors of the palace, the press office was monitoring the global response. News organizations across multiple continents were preparing their coverage, and editors were conferring about the appropriate tone for their reporting. The story demanded sensitivity. This was not a political scandal or constitutional crisis in the traditional sense. It was a family navigating medical circumstances that would affect a child's future, and most reputable outlets recognized the need for restraint. Headlines were being chosen carefully, focusing on terms like resilience, family strength, and adaptation, rather than speculation about specific diagnoses or dramatic implications for the line of succession. Meanwhile, in a private study within the residential quarters, Prince Louis sat in a chair facing a fireplace. The flames cast moving shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of quiet contemplation. Several of his tutors and advisors had gathered, sitting in a loose semicircle around him. Despite the protective bubble created by the palace walls, the young prince seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. His life, which until now had been shaped primarily by the ordinary experiences of childhood within an extraordinary family, was entering a new phase. The advisors spoke to him gently, explaining what the public announcement meant in practical terms. Certain expectations that might have been placed on him in the future would be adjusted. Some ceremonial roles that royal children typically grow into would be postponed or perhaps reconsidered entirely. The explanation was framed not as a loss, but as an adaptation, a recognition that different paths of service exist within the framework of royal duty. One of his councillors emphasized that the value of a life connected to the crown was not measured by the number of public appearances or ceremonial functions attended, but by the integrity and purpose with which that life was lived. The prince listened carefully, processing information that would be challenging for someone of any age to fully grasp. There was a maturity in his attention, a quality observers had noted in him before. He asked questions that revealed his awareness of how this news might affect not only himself, but his siblings and the broader structure of royal responsibilities. The adults in the room answered as honestly as they could, acknowledging uncertainties while providing reassurance about the constants that would remain. In another part of the palace, senior members of the royal household had convened in the council chamber. This room, with its polished wood and historical weight, had been the site of countless significant discussions throughout the centuries. Tonight's meeting focused on precedent and adaptation. Archival records had been retrieved, showing other moments in history when the expected trajectory of royal life had been altered by circumstance. The monarchy had always been an institution defined by tradition, yet it had also demonstrated capacity for evolution when necessary. The discussion among these senior advisors centered on practical matters. They considered public expectations, constitutional symbolism, and the long-term continuity of the monarchy. However, the tone was notably absent of any suggestion of failure or diminishment. Instead, the conversation focused on how to thoughtfully adapt centuries-old structures to accommodate the reality of a young person's medical needs. The advisors recognized they were not just making decisions about protocol. They were helping to shape how a modern monarchy responds to human vulnerability. Outside the palace gates, the crowd continued to grow as the night deepened. A small choir of schoolchildren had arrived, their voices rising in gentle song that drifted across the courtyard. Police officers were present, but their role was clearly one of facilitating a peaceful gathering rather than managing any threat of disorder. Streetlights reflected off the wet cobblestones, creating a scene that felt more like a vigil than a protest. The atmosphere was one of collective concern expressed through quiet solidarity. The palace flag hung at half-mast, a symbolic gesture that typically signals mourning. In this case, it represented something more nuanced. It was an acknowledgement that a chapter had closed, that expectations carefully built over years would now be reconsidered. The monarchy has always communicated through such symbolic gestures, understanding that visual language often carries meaning more effectively than official statements. High above, in the grand gallery where portraits of past monarchs line the walls, painted eyes seem to look down on the unfolding scene. Kings who had ruled during times of conflict, queens who had navigated political transformation, and heirs who had carried private struggles invisible to their subjects. Each of these figures had faced their own challenges within the framework of duty and tradition. Now, another young royal was joining that long history, his journey taking a form that previous generations might not have anticipated, but could perhaps have understood. The evening settled into a contemplative quiet. The young prince remained by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames. The crowd outside maintained their vigil. And within the corridors of power, conversations continued about how best to honor both tradition and the very human needs of a child born into extraordinary circumstances. This was not an ending, but rather the beginning of a process that would require wisdom, compassion, and a willingness to imagine what service and duty might look like when shaped by different realities than those of the past. Morning light broke across London with a pale glow that spread slowly over the city. By the time the sun had fully risen, Buckingham Palace was already bathed in a silvery illumination that highlighted the intricate details of its architecture. The capital was beginning another day, but the atmosphere felt distinctly different from usual mornings. There was a subdued quality to the way people moved through the streets, a sense that the nation was collectively processing something significant. Newspapers sold out quickly at kiosks throughout the city. Commuters stood reading the headlines during their morning routines, their expressions thoughtful rather than gossiping. The coverage was notably restrained, with major publications choosing dignified fonts and measured language. Citizens gathered in cafes, sharing glances more than words, as if recognizing that something delicate had shifted within an institution that many had previously taken for granted as unchanging. The story of Prince Louis and his altered future had touched something deeper than typical royal news. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations were underway for what would be one of the most important meetings in recent memory. The Privy Council chamber, a room steeped in centuries of constitutional history, had been arranged for a confidential assembly. This was the space where monarchs had signed treaties, made declarations during times of war, and made decisions that shaped the course of the nation. Heavy drapes filtered the morning sunlight into narrow beams that fell across the long mahogany table at the room's center. Senior advisors began arriving shortly after 8 in the morning. They included legal counsel specializing in constitutional matters, representatives from the Crown Estate, senior courtiers who managed the daily operations of the royal household, and several individuals whose expertise lay in historical precedent. Each person entering the room understood the gravity of what was being discussed. Their conversations were kept to hushed tones, aware that the decisions made here would have implications stretching far into the future. At precisely 9 o'clock, the king entered the chamber. His presence commanded attention, not through dramatic gesture, but through the quiet authority that comes from both lineage and personal bearing. He took his seat at the head of the table, folded his hands, and nodded for the proceedings to begin. Before him lay a stack of documents, each one bearing the royal crest and sealed with red wax, the traditional marker of official palace correspondence. The briefing began with a medical summary. Over the previous night, physicians from private royal medical facilities had submitted their comprehensive assessments. These doctors, all bound by strict confidentiality agreements, had been monitoring the young prince for several years. Their findings had been supplemented by second opinions from specialists at highly regarded medical institutions, all consulted discreetly to avoid alerting the media before the family was ready to make any public statement. The medical consensus was clear and carefully documented. Prince Louis would be capable of living a full and meaningful life. His intellectual development was progressing normally, and he possessed many of the qualities that would serve him well in various capacities. However, the physicians emphasized that certain types of strain needed to be carefully managed. Prolonged public engagements, the pressure of constant ceremonial duties, and the intense scrutiny that comes with senior royal life could potentially impact his long-term health and well-being. The recommendation was not that he be removed from royal life entirely, but that his role be thoughtfully tailored to accommodate his specific needs. The council members had not gathered to debate the medical science itself. The expertise of the physicians was accepted without question. Instead, the discussion focused on what this meant for the institution of monarchy. Tradition had long assumed that all children born into the direct line of succession would undergo a specific trajectory of preparation. They would gradually take on public duties, attend diplomatic functions, participate in state ceremonies, and eventually assume senior roles within the royal structure. This expectation was now being challenged by medical reality. One senior advisor proposed a framework where Prince Louis would maintain a connection to royal service, but through channels that required less public exposure. The suggestion included possible roles in archival work, cultural preservation, or patronage of organizations where his involvement could be meaningful without requiring the constant public appearances that define senior royal life. Another council member suggested focusing on educational initiatives or heritage projects, areas where contributions could be made largely behind the scenes. A minister with expertise in cultural affairs spoke passionately about the need for evolution within the monarchy. She argued that the institution's relevance in modern society depended partly on its ability to demonstrate humanity and flexibility. A monarchy that rigidly enforced expectations without regard for individual circumstances risked appearing disconnected from the values of contemporary society. She emphasized that adapting to accommodate Prince Louis's needs was not a sign of weakness, but rather an indication of an institution capable of balancing tradition with compassion. Throughout the discussion, the king listened intently. His role placed him in a uniquely difficult position, requiring him to balance the responsibilities of sovereign leadership with the instincts of a father. Every suggestion, every proposed framework had to be evaluated through both lenses. After allowing the advisors to present their perspectives and debate various approaches, he finally spoke. His words were measured and reflected deep consideration. He stated that service to the crown should be understood as a calling rather than a confinement. The monarchy, he argued, must not demand from its own family members sacrifices that would be considered unreasonable if applied to ordinary citizens. As long as Prince Louis lived with honour and found ways to contribute meaningfully to society, the specific form of that contribution need not mirror historical precedent exactly. The fundamental values of duty and service could be expressed through many different paths. While these deliberations took place within the palace walls, life outside continued with what could only be described as uneasy normalcy. By midday, palace kitchen staff had prepared refreshments that were distributed to the flower bearers and supporters who remained gathered beyond the gates. Church bells rang across Westminster, not in mourning, but as a gesture of solidarity with the royal family. The sound echoed across the Thames, a reminder of the close relationship between the monarchy and the broader public. Social media and online platforms filled with reflections about vulnerability, compassion, and modern leadership. Commentators from various backgrounds weighed in on what this moment meant for the institution. Many praised the royal family's decision to be transparent about Prince Louis's situation rather than maintaining absolute secrecy. Some argued that this openness represented exactly the kind of evolution necessary for the monarchy to remain relevant. A smaller group of voices questioned whether the balance between privacy and constitutional transparency had been struck correctly, though even these dissenting opinions were expressed respectfully. By afternoon, diplomatic offices throughout the Commonwealth nations had received encrypted briefings about the situation. These communications assured Allied governments that the line of succession remained clear and stable, and that the adjustments to Prince Louis's role would not create any constitutional complications. Several world leaders responded with personal letters expressing empathy and respect for the family's handling of a difficult situation. The international response reflected widespread understanding that every institution, regardless of its historical prestige, must occasionally adapt to human realities. In a quieter corner of the palace, Prince Louis spent the day following his usual educational routine. His tutors maintained focus on literature, geography, and historical studies, attempting to provide stability through familiar structure. However, they noticed his attention drifting more than usual. During breaks between lessons, he asked questions that revealed his processing of recent events. He wondered aloud whether responsibilities he had imagined for himself would disappear entirely. He expressed concern about whether his siblings would face increased pressure because of his situation. The questions reflected a maturity and awareness that went beyond his years. That evening, the Princess of Wales joined her son for supper in a private salon overlooking the palace gardens. The meal had been carefully chosen to include his favourite dishes, an effort to provide comfort through familiar tastes. Their conversation unfolded with natural pauses, the kind that occur when both parties are processing complex emotions. He confessed that he worried about disappointing people, about not living up to expectations that had been placed on him simply by virtue of his birth. His mother responded with characteristic grace and wisdom. She explained that disappointment only occurs when someone abandons their purpose entirely, and his purpose has not disappeared. It had simply taken on a different shape than what might have been anticipated. The most important thing, she emphasized, was finding ways to contribute and serve that aligned with who he actually was, rather than trying to force himself into a predetermined mold that might not fit. He looked up at her with cautious hope beginning to replace some of the worry that had clouded his expression. As twilight settled over London, one final meeting concluded the day's internal discussions. The King signed a formal resolution authorising the Communications Office to prepare a follow-up statement. This second announcement would provide additional clarity about Prince Louis's continuing education, the ongoing medical support he would receive, and the evolving nature of his future contributions to the monarchy. The goal was not to be overly revealing about private medical matters, but to provide enough information to calm public speculation and demonstrate that thoughtful planning was underway. Outside, the palace lights began illuminating one by one, creating a warm glow against the darkening sky. The crowd that had maintained their vigil throughout the day held candles and small torches, their lights reflecting off the wet pavement like scattered stars. Some sang hymns, their voices carrying a message not of grief, but of unity and support. The palace gates remained closed, but the invisible connection between the institution and the people it represented felt somehow strengthened, rather than weakened by the vulnerability that had been acknowledged. The nation was learning that strength could be found not just in Stoic tradition, but in honest adaptation to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The announcement had been public for only a few days, yet its impact had already spread through every layer of British society. London woke to overcast skies that cast the city in muted tones of grey stone and soft morning light. People walked through the streets with newspapers tucked under their arms, sipping their morning tea in contemplative silence rather than engaging in the usual chatter about politics or sports. Something had shifted in the national consciousness, and the conversation about Prince Louis had evolved beyond simple concern about his health into a broader discussion about what it means to serve within a hereditary institution in the modern age. By mid-morning, public institutions across the country had begun organising forums and panel discussions. Universities hosted conversations where historians sat alongside sociologists and constitutional experts to examine whether centuries-old traditions should adapt to accommodate individual well-being. These discussions attracted significant attendance, with lecture halls filling beyond capacity as students and faculty members sought to engage with questions that suddenly felt urgent and relevant. Some argued passionately that true leadership required creating space for personal growth and individual needs rather than demanding rigid conformity to historical precedent. Others countered that the monarchy derived its very relevance from continuity and tradition, warning that too much flexibility might undermine the institution's foundation. Despite the passion on both sides, the discourse remained largely respectful, as if participants understood that their words might echo beyond academic halls and influence real decisions being made within palace walls. In homes and classrooms throughout the nation, the matter took on a more intimate and personal dimension. Teachers guided students through discussions about empathy for public figures, reminding them that members of the royal family, despite their titles and privileges, were still human beings who did not choose the circumstances of their birth. At one rural primary school in the countryside, children spent an afternoon creating handmade cards decorated with watercolour paintings in shades of gold and blue. Their messages, written in careful handwriting, spoke not about duty or titles, but about courage, kindness, and hope for happiness. These cards, along with thousands of others from across the country, would eventually arrive at the palace in large canvas mailbags, sorted carefully by staff members in a hall temporarily converted into an archive of public affection. Within 3 days of the initial announcement, letters were arriving by the thousands. Palace staff worked in shifts to process the volume of correspondence, reading each message and cataloguing them for potential response. The contents varied widely, from formal letters of support from civic organisations to simple notes from elderly citizens who had followed the royal family for decades. Many shared personal stories about family members who faced similar challenges, drawing parallels between their own experiences and what the royal family was navigating. The common thread running through nearly all of them was compassion and a recognition that vulnerability was a universal human experience, regardless of social position. The media landscape underwent a noticeable transformation during this period. Television commentators and radio hosts who typically engaged in sharp political debate adopted a markedly different tone when discussing Prince Louis and his family. Rather than their usual adversarial approach, many encouraged listeners to call in and share their own stories about navigating expectations and limitations. The phone lines stayed busy for hours as people shared experiences about children facing invisible struggles, lives reshaped by chronic illness, or the emotional burdens of trying to meet expectations that ultimately proved incompatible with personal reality. These voices, though not connected to royalty, created a tapestry of shared human experience that resonated deeply. The nation was reminded that while the royal family occupied a unique position, the challenges they faced were not entirely foreign to ordinary life. Meanwhile, the palace communications team worked diligently on preparing a follow-up statement. Multiple drafts were circulated among physicians, constitutional scholars, heritage advisors, and senior members of the royal family. Each revision aimed to strike the delicate balance between providing sufficient transparency to satisfy public interest and maintaining appropriate boundaries around private medical information. The final version acknowledged that Prince Louis would require ongoing medical support and monitoring throughout his life, while affirming his continued education and his readiness to contribute to royal service in ways that might differ from traditional expectations. The statement carefully avoided providing specific diagnoses or prognoses, instead emphasizing dignity, capability, and the importance of tailoring expectations to individual circumstances. When the second statement was released, it generated a mixture of relief and continued contemplation among the public. Many people appreciated the additional clarity and the straightforward acknowledgement that adaptations would be necessary. However, questions remained about what exactly the future would hold, both for Prince Louis and for the broader structure of royal responsibilities. The uncertainty itself seemed to reflect the reality that the family was navigating uncharted territory, making decisions as circumstances evolved rather than following a predetermined script. International response to the situation demonstrated remarkable consistency across different nations and political systems. Embassies throughout Europe and the Commonwealth conveyed messages of solidarity with the British royal family. Several world leaders suggested potential collaborative projects that Prince Louis might participate in as he grew older, proposals that emphasized cultural exchange and education rather than formal diplomatic ceremony. Others offered to expand existing philanthropic networks to create opportunities for contribution that would not require intensive public exposure. The underlying message from international observers was one of respect and recognition that hereditary institutions, however symbolic their role might be in modern governance, still required compassion when individual circumstances demanded it. As official channels addressed institutional concerns, daily operations at the palace continued with subtle but significant adjustments. State visitors still arrived and were greeted with full ceremonial protocols, though increasingly these duties were being handled by senior royals other than Prince Louis. Princess Charlotte began attending select engagements that might previously have involved her younger brother. Her composure and natural ease in public settings impressed observers, though she carried these additional responsibilities with notable humility, never appearing to overshadow her brother's journey or claim prominence at his expense. Prince George, as the eldest sibling and future heir, found his own schedule adjusting to accommodate the family's evolving circumstances. His studies expanded to include more intensive preparation in international relations and constitutional law. The increased visibility of both older siblings was carefully managed to avoid any impression that they were stepping in to compensate for a deficiency. Instead, palace communications emphasized that this was an example of familial solidarity, with different members of the family contributing in ways that suited their individual circumstances and capabilities. Public perception continued to evolve as days passed. The initial whispers of speculation and the conspiracy theories that briefly circulated in less reputable corners of social media gradually faded under the weight of consistent, clear communication from official sources. Citizens began to recognize that the announcement represented not a scandal or crisis, but rather an act of honesty from a family that had long existed under intense public scrutiny. Newspaper coverage shifted from anxious headlines questioning the future of the monarchy to more measured profiles focusing on resilience and adaptation. One widely circulated newspaper editorial captured the emerging consensus particularly well. The piece argued that history would remember this moment not because of illness or limitation, but because of the compassion and flexibility demonstrated by an institution often perceived as rigid and unchanging. The editorial suggested that the monarchy's willingness to acknowledge and accommodate individual needs, rather than forcing conformity to tradition, might ultimately strengthen rather than weaken its bond with contemporary society. Inside the palace, Prince Louis continued his education, though his curriculum began to shift in subtle ways. Tutors introduced new subjects focused on conservation science, literary analysis, and the techniques involved in preserving cultural heritage. Curators from various royal estates visited to discuss the challenges of maintaining historical artifacts, restoring damaged documents, and protecting artworks for future generations. The young prince showed particular interest in questions about restoration philosophy, asking thoughtful questions about whether damaged or aged items should be returned to their original condition, or whether the marks of time and wear were themselves part of an object's story. In the evenings, he walked through the private gardens accompanied by trusted advisors and security personnel. These walks provided opportunities for conversations that ranged from ordinary childhood concerns to profound questions about purpose and legacy. During one such walk, he asked whether history valued people who contributed from outside the public spotlight. One of his longtime advisors responded that legacy was ultimately measured not by the size of crowds one attracted, but by what one gave to others, particularly in moments when no recognition or applause followed. The prince absorbed these words carefully, beginning to construct a framework for understanding his own emerging path. His family made deliberate efforts to shield him from external pressures while maintaining normal family dynamics. They shared private meals together, played games in the evening, and encouraged moments of laughter and lightness amid the weight of public attention. Each interaction reinforced the message that lineage and title did not erase fundamental humanity or the importance of simply being together as a family. As evening descended across the capital, citizens continued their quiet demonstrations of support. Candles were lit along the Thames riverbanks and on the steps of historic cathedrals throughout London. Musicians gathered in public squares to perform gentle orchestral pieces, their melodies drifting through the cool air. The entire nation seemed to exhale collectively, embracing uncertainty without succumbing to fear or anxiety. What might have become a crisis of confidence had instead transformed into an opportunity for the country to demonstrate its capacity for empathy and its recognition that even institutions built on centuries of tradition must occasionally bend to accommodate human reality. Winter settled over London with a quiet intensity that transformed the capital into a landscape of soft lamplight and distant church bells. Snow arrived not in heavy storms, but in gentle flurries that dusted the iron railings surrounding Buckingham Palace and collected on the bronze statues near the Victoria Memorial. The atmosphere felt contemplative rather than somber, a season that invited reflection rather than despair. Citizens moved through the city wrapped in heavy coats and woolen scarves, their conversations hushed and thoughtful. The initial shock surrounding the announcement about Prince Louis had faded, replaced by a maturing understanding of how vulnerability and adaptation could reshape institutional legacy. As weeks passed, candlelight vigils began appearing across the country. These gatherings emerged in village squares, outside historic university buildings, and along coastal areas where waves crashed against ancient stone walls. Nobody coordinated these events through official channels or government directives. They arose organically from communities moved by a shared sense of empathy and connection. At each vigil, someone would read poetry, another might play violin or guitar, and children held paper lanterns decorated with hand-drawn crowns and symbols of hope. The tone remained reverent throughout, as if the nation had collectively recognized that compassion itself had become a meaningful form of allegiance to the monarchy. Television networks aired special documentary programs exploring the history of royal families navigating personal hardship. Historians recounted stories of kings and queens who had struggled with illness, loss, or private suffering while maintaining their public responsibilities. Some had endured their challenges in complete secrecy, bound by the expectation that monarchs should appear invulnerable. Others had quietly withdrawn from public life to seek personal healing or pursue scholarly interests away from ceremonial demands. The contrast between those hidden historical struggles and the present moment was striking. Modern society no longer accepts secrecy as a form of strength. The decision by Prince Louis's family to speak openly about his situation allowed past and present to converge, creating what many commentators described as a more authentic and humane narrative about royal life. Within the palace walls, winter brought both stillness and renewed purpose. Plans were quietly developed to reorganize the distribution of royal duties among family members. Princess Charlotte, demonstrating natural poise and genuine comfort in public settings, began taking on additional engagements representing the crown. Her schedule expanded to include visits to schools, participation in cultural events, and attendance at charitable receptions throughout the country. Observers noted that she approached these responsibilities not as burdens placed upon her, but with a sense of shared family commitment. She was not replacing her brother, but walking alongside him in a different capacity, honoring the bond that transcended ceremonial expectations. Prince George entered a new phase of preparation for his eventual role as future monarch. His education broadened to encompass constitutional theory, the complexities of Commonwealth relations, and the diplomatic skills necessary for representing the nation on the world stage. Though still young, he approached his studies with a quiet seriousness that reflected both his understanding of future responsibilities and the example set by previous generations. His mentors emphasized that true authority came not from volume or assertion, but from restraint, wisdom, and genuine concern for the welfare of others. On an evening when fresh snow had blanketed the palace gardens, Prince George ventured outside, accompanied by one of his longtime advisors. Lanterns hanging from wrought iron posts illuminated narrow pathways lined with ancient oak trees, their branches bowing under the weight of accumulated snow. The scene felt removed from the grand ceremonial halls and formal expectations that had defined much of his upbringing. As they walked in companionable silence, the advisor spoke about monarchs throughout history who had served from positions outside the direct line of throne succession. Some had devoted themselves to scholarly pursuits and the preservation of cultural heritage. Others had championed spiritual leadership or worked quietly in philanthropic endeavors that made profound differences in people's lives without generating headlines. They paused beside a marble fountain at the center of the garden, its water frozen into crystalline stillness that captured and reflected the golden lantern light. Prince George confessed a fear that had been troubling him, a concern that his younger brother might somehow be forgotten by history if he stepped away from traditional ceremonial roles. The advisor responded thoughtfully, explaining that history ultimately remembers those who illuminate the paths of others rather than simply those who shine brightest in public view. Legacy, he suggested, was like a tapestry woven from countless individual threads rather than a single prominent strand. The prince considered these words carefully, gazing at the frozen fountain as if trying to see beyond the present moment into the decades and centuries ahead. Inside the palace, other quiet transformations continued. Palace staff reorganized calendars and schedules to reflect new patterns of royal representation. Historians began curating archival materials for future exhibitions that would celebrate diverse forms of service to the crown throughout the centuries. Charitable organizations drafted proposals aligned with Prince Louis's developing interests in cultural preservation and educational advocacy. Each action demonstrated that adaptation was not weakening tradition, but refining it, making it more responsive to human reality while maintaining its essential character. Public sentiment across the nation continued to soften and mature. Newspaper editorials praised the royal family's willingness to acknowledge limitations openly rather than maintaining rigid facades. Writers argued that the monarchy had gained credibility and moral authority through its demonstration of humanity. Compassion, they suggested, had become a cornerstone of modern sovereignty, and the willingness to adapt traditions showed strength rather than weakness. The narrative surrounding Prince Louis had shifted decisively from one of retreat or diminishment to a story about reimagining what service and duty could mean when approached with flexibility and genuine concern for individual well-being. International observers watched these developments with measured admiration. In capitals around the world, political analysts expressed surprise that such transparent acknowledgement of personal challenges within a royal family could actually strengthen national unity rather than undermining it. Cultural commentators wrote essays comparing historical periods when royal families maintained absolute secrecy about personal matters with this contemporary moment of relative openness. Some predicted that future generations of historians would cite this period as a significant turning point in the evolution of constitutional monarchy, a moment when ancient institutions demonstrated their capacity to balance tradition with contemporary values of authenticity and human dignity. In the final weeks of winter, the palace hosted a small private ceremony in the grand ballroom. Only immediate family members and a handful of close advisors attended. No cameras recorded the proceedings, and no journalists waited outside seeking details. The gathering was not a formal state occasion, but rather a quiet reaffirmation of family bonds and shared commitment to service in whatever forms it might take. A string quartet played softly in one corner of the ornate room. Prince Louis stood with his siblings beside him as their father addressed them privately, acknowledging both the challenges they faced together and the strength they drew from one another. As the evening concluded, the young prince looked across the ballroom toward the towering portraits of past monarchs that lined the walls. Their painted eyes seemed to regard him with silent understanding. He felt not diminished by the changes in his expected path, but somehow more clearly seen and accepted for who he actually was. The nation had confronted significant change, not with upheaval, but with wisdom and grace. And the royal family had demonstrated that even institutions built on centuries of unchanging tradition could embrace a more human truth without losing their essential character or purpose.